And now this is turn 6, early fall, so I've claimed that throne. And then here, my Ichthyid mercenaries are going underwater, and they have no trouble whatsoever beating these Tritons. Tritons are fast, but they have only a coral knife attack, which is length 0, so it's easily repelled and has low chance of repelling attacks on their own. They have no protection because they're completely unarmored, and basic human stats, 10 across the board for everything, aside from their magic resistance. So while they're very fast, they can get into combat quickly. My guys are positioned correctly in order to get the first hit, and with their nets and stone spears, yeah, they have no trouble beating these Tritons. Tritons are out very quickly after taking some heavy losses, and the battle's won. 0 losses from my Ichthyids, and I take on this very rich underwater province. Here, I finally managed to beat these Indies. Crossmen get some lucky shots right off the bat. These guys are actually firing at my blind fighters. One of my crossbows, I think, took some arrows, or some of my crossbows, I think, took some arrows there just by incident, because they happened to be close by the blind fighters at the time. And then here, once they get into melee, you can clearly see the superiority of my sacreds. Oh, worth noting, the reason that these heavy infantry are back here is that sometimes Indies set some heavy infantry to guard commander, and then these guys just kind of stick around here in the back. And under withering crossbow fire and fighting these elite sacreds, they are eventually routed, and I take no losses once taking on that province. Oh yeah, so as far as like the bodyguard thing goes, they will only do that to spellcasters, but they count these indie priests here as mages, which is why that priest had a couple heavy infantry, and when that priest got hit by a crossbow bolt and died, the heavy infantry no longer had a commander to guard, which is why they started walking forward to help engage the blind fighters. Here in Halimir, we continue to expand over towards Pythium. And once again, elite sacreds, regular infantry. Even surrounded, the blind fighters hold up very well. Once again, no losses, so very good turn. And an unexpected event. Oh, this is fortunate. I managed to get a Lightless Lantern. These are great. We're going to be building a lot of these once we hit Construction 6. With a research bonus of 12, it's kind of like having a free research mage. My alchemists actually research at 12 in Drain 1, so it's like having an extra 135 gold mage researching. It's awesome. Here I'm once again limited by resources rather than gold, so I go back to recruiting only light crossbowmen. And I am also going to start building a fort shortly. So I'm going to be recruiting a scout here. I'm picking this as the site for my first additional fort, mostly as a method, or mostly just as a means of using as many resources as possible. So surrounded by these forests here and this mountain province here, this fort is going to have a ton of resources. I'm not sure if I'm going to be having any early wars. I basically told Pythium that this is going to be our border here, so I'm going to let him have this farm, because the fact that he got all the way up over here leads me to believe that he's somewhere in this area. So this farm is most likely much closer to his cap than mine, and if you have a neighbor and you're very close to that neighbor's capital, they're more likely to fight you than someone else. So as just a means of avoiding that early war, I'm going to let him take on this farm. At the time I didn't know what his bless was, so I thought that it would be difficult for him to beat crossbowmen, and it sort of was, but not once he pulled his sacreds out. And then, meanwhile, by building my fort here and getting all these resources, I'm going to be able to amass a lot of troops early if necessary, so if I do need to start fighting Pythium early, I can build a bunch of crossbowmen and potentially full blind fighter recruitment. And as I mentioned in the overview, Agartha is actually very good early, so I think that I can actually take on Pythium when we both lack research, and I'm also going to be able to tailor my research to fighting Pythium early if necessary. And that's the turn. Alright, this is fall in the first year of the Ascension Wars, and we found 2 more magic sites. So Garden of Frozen Flowers is some water income, Battlefield is death income, so very good there. This guy was just set to patrol because he wasn't doing anything else. Here in Dovin, this is one of my expansion parties taking on what looked like an easy province, and it was. So just militia, heavy infantry. Yeah, nothing really concerning here. They're only just nicking these blind fighters here, and they're getting whacked by the crossbows all the while. My one loss here was actually to friendly fire when a crossbowman killed a blind fighter, so that's too bad, but it's just one sacred. My expansion is going very well. Here, again, relatively easy province. This one has at least some crossbows, which can do some damage, but it's nothing too concerning. So this was a little bit weird in that this group of heavy infantry was locked onto this squad, but they picked this unit in particular. And this guy has a bunch of afflictions, so he is limp, he is crippled, he has lost an arm, so he's both very slow moving. He's basically going to be moving 1 square, if that, when he does try to move. And because he lost an arm, he also has no shield. So he's lagging behind the others and less capable of defending himself. So these guys are all focusing on this guy. With my Bless and his heavy armor, he's actually able to survive, even though he's got what looks like 9 heavy infantry wailing into him, while the rest of my blind fighters fight these guys. Eventually they do manage to bring him down, but it's worth noting that they still are locked onto this squad, so the rest of their guys are going to come back and surround these blind fighters here. Luckily, my blind fighters are awesome, so they don't care, they just kill them. And here, because my blind fighters are between them and their escape, they are going to fight to the death. But they also have that malice from routing, if you'll recall, so they're none too dangerous. And with that, the province is captured. My attempt at expanding underwater did not go well. So there were more Ichthyids here than I had, and some of these guys are these Ichthyid warriors, which are heavily armored. So the reason that I went for this Ichthyid province is that when it comes to my expanding underwater, I want to be recruiting these guys instead of the aquatic tritons. Because these guys are amphibious, I'm able to take them onto land, so if I do succeed in capturing the lake entirely, then they're going to continue being useful, both for raiding enemy coastal provinces, and, you know, just in general providing a cheap front line. These guys have 17 HP and 14 protection while costing only 10 gold, so HP for gold, they're among the best units in the game. They're not very good at actually killing things, because they've only got stone spears and below average combat stats. But, you know, good morale, great HP and decent protection, so definitely very worth buying. And as you saw when fighting those tritons, they do relatively well underwater as well. Here, my totally unarmored guys are eventually beaten by the armor and shield-toting Ichthyds, so I do lose that mercenary group. However, I do also manage to kill a bunch, so almost all these Ichthyds were gone. As you saw, that squad routed, so all but one of them made it off the battlefield, and I killed one of the Ichthyid lords. So with only 13 left, even though most of them are warriors now, I should be able to take this on just by recruiting those indie tritons that I have underwater, although I'm going to hope to be able to find mercenaries in order to make that easier. And then here, my final province. This one I take on because of a weird scripting thing that the AI does. So, this is a Darkmind province. Darkmind provinces are potentially dangerous because, as you see, they've got these mages here. They have gems which can potentially summon swarms, and more importantly, blood slaves. So that's able to, or that's going to let them cast some blood magic. So one of the more dangerous blood spells is Leech, which is going to be like a always accurate, armor negating, high damage spell, which can potentially each clear out a whole square of my units, even from all the way across the battlefield. The AI doesn't like casting that spell compared to the summoning spells like Swarm and Summon Imps, but the AI likes buff spells even more, and that's what works out in my favor here. So Sabbath Slave and Sabbath Master are actually pretty useful spells for humans. The Sabbath's Master here has now 2 slaves, so he has a magic boost of 1. So that means he's effectively Nature 2 or Blood 3, so he can cast some higher level spells, which is potentially good. But the Communion Slave himself is completely paralyzed, so he's not going to be able to cast any magic. He's only serving as a booster. So that means that we've already got 2 mages out of the fight, basically just serving as batteries. And then, meanwhile, my crossbows are still doing okay here. And as you saw there, 2 more guys just cast Communion, or Sabbath Slave. So now there's only 1 active mage. And he just cast Sabbath Slave. So now all these mages have essentially just incapacitated themselves. The woodsmen can get into range of my infantry. I took the remainder of that 1 expansion party's infantry here along with, just, to hopefully lose them, and if not, at least, provide some extra swords. The woodsman blowpipes here, they don't do very much damage, but when they do damage, they apply a large amount of fatigue. This fatigue is potentially dangerous. Let's see if I can find one of these guys. Yeah, because when your fatigue is higher, you have lower effective attack and defense in combat, and when your fatigue is at 100, you don't do anything at all. It also makes you more susceptible to critical hits. Fortunately, there isn't a whole lot to actually hit these guys to crit them, so once the blowpipes are gone, and the mages have all Sabbath slaved themselves into uselessness, only the Darkbind itself is left. While it does have bludgeoning and piercing resistance and a simply massive HP pool, it's all on its own right now, so even having 3 attacks isn't going to be enough to kill more than one of my guys. And given it's surrounded, it does eventually die, and with these guys routed off the field, there's no longer any active enemies, it's just these paralyzed mages. And Blood Slaves themselves don't really fight, so, yeah. The only losses that I can take here are to friendly fire. And that's precisely what happens. So I do lose a couple guys, Agarthan infantry and light infantry. And I also find the Axe of Sharpness. So this item isn't particularly useful, given that I don't plan on sending my commander into melee. But, I may as well keep it until I can bring it to a lab. Since it does deal armor-piercing damage, it's potentially useful against a single high protection target. And now I just need to pick out my new expansion targets. So this one looks easy. It's a nice militia, archer, and heavy infantry province, so it should be relatively straightforward to take down. And I'm just keeping my formation more or less the same, just these guys in front. Here, I'm going to be combining my expansion parties in order to take on the heavy cavalry province, which is potentially difficult, and then after they take it, hopefully they'll be able to split up and take 2 different provinces here at the same time. I'm not sure what all I'll find down in this area, and it may be that I end up being too close to Pythium in order to take all the provinces that I'd like, but militia and light cavalry are both relatively weak offensively, so I should be able to take that on with my blind fighters not taking any losses. Meanwhile, I've started my castle over here. This is a good position for it because of all of these surrounding provinces. That means that it's going to be drawing in a lot of resources, even if the resources currently in the province aren't too high. Additionally, while it's not the highest income province that I have, it still does have a very good population, which means that the income's going to be still fairly decent, and it's also going to go up a bit more as my growth scales tick in. And then the castle is going to increase the income that that province produces as well. Meanwhile, I've sent out this guy to lead my new expansion party. Because blind fighters are magic beings, they don't actually take up regular leadership, which means that he can lead a full complement of crossbowmen as well. He's going to be positioned a little ways behind them in order to bless them up. While he's not as resilient as the blind lords, he does have a slightly... Oh wait, nope, these guys are still H1, so they have the same range bless, but given that they're positioned behind them and that the blind fighters should be drawing the aggro, he should be kept fairly safe, and then meanwhile my crossbowmen can do the actual killing while the blind fighters soak the hits. And that is the turn. Turn 8. So Pythium and I had talked briefly about my underwater adventure, and he basically said that he's not going to be contesting the UW stuff. As far as the expansion battles go, I'm not going to bother taking a look at the fights themselves. It's fairly straightforward what happened here. We've got our double blessed blind fighters and lots of crossbows. With only 4 heavy cavalry, that's just not enough to break the blind fighters at all. 16 heavy infantry could do some damage, but we can assume that with all these crossbows firing away at them and the blind fighters slashing back, blind fighters stood up quite well. Here we had a couple more losses amongst our regular infantry, which also is not too surprising. These guys aren't nearly as tanky, and they certainly don't have the regeneration or bonus HP that the blind fighters do. So we took just some minor acceptable losses there. As far as our events go, this is something that we're probably going to be seeing a fair bit of. They're sometimes referred to as misfortune chains, because the events that generate additional misfortune require poor luck to begin with, and then they make your luck significantly worse, which then means that you're in this spiral of getting persistently bad events. Here, we actually got free gems, which is somewhat lucky, or very lucky actually, given that we have misfortune scales, but luckily I take luck 3 in real life, which helps make up for misfortune scales in game. Here, this looks like a pretty tough province, but luckily this army is really stacked, so 12 sacreds, 40 crossbows, should be fairly easy. Here, we are splitting up our army. This is actually a difficult province type in that it has both heavy cavalry and crossbows. With only 10 showing up, it can't have more than 40 units in general, and we can usually bet that it's going to be somewhere on the lower end. So this should be pretty straightforward. We have 5 blind fighters, because any lower than 5 and you end up with squad morale issues. And then we have our crossbows set to fire archers in the hopes of hitting the commander who we expect to be sitting with the crossbows. Here we have our prophet along to cast Divine Blessing and Smite, so I'll provide just a little bit of additional firepower. And again, 5 blind fighters and our extra crossbows. Light cavalries, you can see here these guys have bows, they're going to be archer units. They're lightly armored, and once again the commander will most likely be sitting behind them. We did not rebid the Inquisitor. Without his troops, he's actually not particularly impressive. He's still helpful, but just not anything amazing. This guy's set to patrol. That's going to help reduce the unrest here a little bit, and he doesn't yet have enough guys in order to take on a province on his own. Given the resource settings on the map, as you can see, we have a lot of resources from these provinces. And given that we have access to relatively low resource cost crossbowmen, I decided to try making a supplementary expansion party out of the Indies. Meanwhile, this guy, who had been previously searching the throne, is now ready to site search the forest, and this castle continues to be built. Given our excellent income, and relatively low upkeep given our sacred expansion parties, we'll probably be looking to start another castle soon. If my peace with Pythium looks like it's persisting, then I most likely will not need my next castle to provide all that many resources, so I can potentially even build it here in the cap circle, or possibly over here on this farm in order to improve the income that gives. Just because, you know, if we don't need the resources quite as much to build more troops, then we may as well take advantage of the extra gold. Since this is another scout province, we're going to be building as many scouts as we can. Can never have too many of those. This province actually has Indie Nature Mages. These aren't the best Indie Nature Mages just because they cost a fair bit of gold and also require a temple to build. But I am going to need to get something, so if I can't find anything better, then in order to get into nature magic, I'll probably start recruiting these guys, and then having them site search, just because you need nature magic in pretty much any nation in order to get into the nature items, so the vine shields and amulets of rejuvenation and so on. And that is turn 8. Alright, this is turn 9. As you can see, we had 4 expansion battles. This one went well. Again, a small number of heavy cavalry just isn't enough to do anything to the blind fighters, and given that we had our prophet here as well, he was able to get some smiting in. Here, similar story, we lost 1 light crossbowman, probably just as a result of a stray crossbow bolt taking him out. And once again, a relatively small number of heavy cavalry means that even a small number of blind fighters can hold them off quite well. But this is a disaster, so I'll just go ahead and show this fight to show off our prodigious misfortune. So here, the archers are all clearly locked onto the blind fighters here. The blind fighters being heavily armored, and the blessed ones at least also have this great HP pool. They're not going to care too much about these archers at all. Our huge number of crossbowmen, by comparison, are already able to do some damage to the enemy heavy cavalry, and in spite of the fact that these guys are being shot at way over here, we get an arrow, and it causes profuse bleeding. So one stray arrow hit our blessed mage, even though he's well behind them, and he's already routing because of the terrible amount of damage that he took, which means that my army is routing as well. Which potentially is a good thing, since it means that they can at least get off the field, but given that he was profusely bleeding, he actually died. So just that one stray arrow took out the one commander and made my expansion party fail. And what's even worse about this is that this strands a huge number of troops, some of which are magical beings, namely the blind fighters, so those guys can't easily just be led on with an indie commander, which means I'm going to have to send another commander from my capital in order to actually use those guys. We did find the Imperial Quarry with our site searcher, so that's some Earth Gem income, so that's nice. Here we saw TNG's expansion. So this is sort of worth looking at just to show you guys what TNG is all about. So on this map, as I'd mentioned a couple times before, there's extra resources just from the game settings. And these guys are foreign recruit, which means that TNG can get them from anywhere. They have a relatively high upkeep cost, given that they're not sacred or anything, but they're essentially just heavy cavalry that have a low resource cost, in spite of the fact that they still have decent heavy cavalry stats. They have a lance, so on their first hit they're going to have 3 attacks, and yeah. So, in spite of the fact that they do have bows, it's generally common practice to use them just as heavy cavalry rather than as archers, because as far as archers go, they're relatively expensive. But as heavy cavalry goes, they're great. So in their lance charge, they already routed these light infantry here, and they do enough damage to the heavy infantry that they can pretty easily break them as well. You can kind of see here that the heavy cavalry are locked onto this light infantry squad, so they're chasing them even as they're routing off the field. But once the light infantry are all gone, they're going to turn around and take on this squadron here, and the Indies are routed well afterwards. So yeah, this is kind of what TNG is all about. They just get these guys from everywhere, and then yeah, lots of heavy cavalry running around. And then this is my next expansion fight, which again is just blind fighters taking everything while crossbows do some killing. We had a bad harvest, so that means we have no income. That's not good. And I've started recruiting just these regular Tritons. So these guys are awful. They are very weak units, as we saw when I was killing them. But they are the only aquatic units that or water-capable units that we have access to at the moment, and I really want to get this province, even if that means burning a bunch of gold to slam a bunch of Tritons into it. And then I'll eventually get the other underwater provinces to get all of the nice income that comes from owning this sea. Right. And then here, we got just a little bit of money. It's kind of a weird event. Very minor. We have a, who got cursed? I guess one soldier got cursed. It's hard to tell who that was. Yeah, this guy. So, he found us some dosh, more than paid for his recruitment cost, and got cursed in the process. Meanwhile, I'm just going to send these guys over here. We got a mercenary company, so that's going to be doing the brunt of the fighting here. We set them up slightly up front so that they can take enemy aggro, because these guys are rather more expendable. And then we have a small squadron of heavy infantry and crossbows to support them, and then these guys are potentially going to be sticking around for a while. Thursmond here is going to lead this little squadron here. We've already seen that heavy cavalry isn't too threatening unless there's a large number of them, because our sacreds are awesome. And then Space Ghost and Wild Panther are going to take on this province. And then these guys are going to be looping down here. We're not sure what's in here, and I don't have a spare scout yet to bounce off of them. given that this guy's building a castle over here on this farm. So I don't want to risk taking on this throne province quite yet, and this one should be pretty straightforward. We don't see any crossbowmen or anything else difficult. Meanwhile, our next Tony Necromancer is going to be leading a couple more blind fighters and yet more crossbows, and then he's going to be picking up as many of these guys as he can carry. Since there's 12 of them, and he has 15 magic being leadership on account of the fact that he has a death random, he can only take 3 additional blind fighters from the capital, so that's all that he's grabbing. And then I'll be recruiting another Catonian Alchemist to do potentially more site searching, and also potentially leading around the additional blind fighters, given that we're going to have a bunch in our capital after this. This castle's coming along nicely. It's going to be finished building relatively soon, 4 turns away. And then this guy can site search here and potentially also build up the lab so that we can start recruiting mages once the castle is complete. And that's turn 9. Alright, this is turn 10. Here we see Marignan. So we found another neighbor. And then Marignan's expansion parties are using their sacreds and crossbows as well. But their sacreds are awful. So Hands of Justice are Marignan's sacred units. They are halberdiers, so they have no shields. They have a plate cuirass, which is okay, but not, like the full plate mail that the blind fighters wear. And because they have halberds, they have no shields, so they are actually quite vulnerable to crossbow fire. They have mediocre combat stats, slightly above average, like, 11-11, which they get a slight bonus to from these guys being experienced. And yeah, like the only thing they have over blind fighters is the fact they're map move 2 and they have lower encumbrance, but they're honestly just generic medium infantry units, with a slight castle defense and patrol bonus. So really unimpressive. They're only worth using at all given that they are sacred and therefore can be blessed. But even against indies, they're unimpressive. The crossbows have to do most of the killing for Marignan's expansion parties. Additionally, generally Marignan needs just to have more guys than Agartha does in order to expand. As you can see, they've got more than our little 5 blind fighter expansion party thing here. And these guys take some damage. I mean, they do win because they've got all those crossbows behind them. But as you can see here, they took 2 sacred losses, whereas our guys would have taken none, and they would have done it with requiring both fewer sacreds and fewer crossbows. Meanwhile, when we fight sacred to sacred, well, we crush them, but we do actually take some losses. So while the halberdiers are fairly unimpressive defensively, he does have more crossbows than I do. And halberds themselves actually just have a very high, or deal a very high amount of damage, which makes them okay against the blind fighters here. And he also has his prophet, which means that he can do some smiting if these guys get in range. And yeah, you can see that here, even with magic resistance 13, they can be smitten, and that does cause some losses. But ultimately, even outnumbered and with superior firepower raining down on them, my blind fighters come out well ahead. And they take on the province. So definitely some losses there. But Marignan loses more, both more sacreds, and he loses some of his crossbows. Here, my mercenaries and heavy infantry expand fine, so that's nice. And here, my blind fighters also expand fine into the heavy cavalry, but they lose quite badly to Pythium's sacreds. So Pythium's expansion party here is actually vastly more expensive than mine. Each of these hydras here cost 200 gold. The hydra hatchlings cost like 35 or something. And we're going to soon see how they are blessed. So this bless is huge. It's Nature 9, you can see that they've got 20% regen rather than just the base 10% regen. So HP and regen comes from the N9 Bless. They have Earth 9, given that they've got the bonus protection and reinvigoration. And they have Air 9, so they have Air Shield 80, which means that they can ignore 80% of the shots fired at them. So, seeing this bless is rather telling. It tells us exactly what Pythium's plan is. And their plan is to build a lot of expensive sacreds and then use them to win fights. This this one must be crippled or something. Yeah, it's got a limp. Hydras have a poison cloud ability, which means that both the hatchlings and the full-size ones deal poison damage to everything that comes near them. They have a bunch of attacks because they have a lot of different heads, and perhaps most importantly, they have a fear aura. So that means that units that get close to them have reduced morale at the end of each turn, similar to how various other auras trigger at the end end of the turn to do some damage in an area around them. These guys reduce morale in an area around them, so their morale should be, what, 17? And then it's reduced by a somewhat random amount, so yeah, it's down to 14 now. And now it's down to 10. And units can recover morale. I'm not exactly 100% sure what the fear mechanisms all are, but there is like a morale, like you'll see morale go up and down as the fear units are fighting them. But more importantly, you can see this poison bar building up. So that's how much poison damage these guys have built up over them. And then at the start of each turn, that poison bar is going to tick down, dealing a variable amount of damage. So you can see that that's basically canceling out their regeneration. And yeah, you can see here how the morale spiked back up a bit. Which means that these guys actually are being whittled down, whereas usually blind fighters are quite immune to that. Meanwhile, they can't really hurt this Hydra. Like, they're doing damage to it, but because it's regenerating 20% of its health every round, it's regenerating 18 HP, so it's just really not coming close to dying. Even through the air shield, our crossbows are occasionally landing and doing some damage, but not as much damage as the blind fighters are taking. It's actually somewhat impressive that even against these ridiculously expensive units with a ridiculously expensive bless, our blind fighters are actually capable of holding up quite well. So that does speak well to to how strong these sacreds are, but we already knew that. And unfortunately, these guys do eventually get whittled down by all these hydras biting them. And we're not going to bother listening to that terrible sound anymore. So we do lose this province to Pythium. However, we do now know what Pythium's bless is, and this is actually going to affect how our research is going to go. So because these guys have an A9 bless, we know that we're not going to be able to rely solely on crossbows and flaming crossbows to take them down. And Hydras also do have a fire vulnerability. They're susceptible to fire damage, which means that they're going to take additional damage, both from when they get lit on fire and from fire damage in general, which means that fire elementals are going to be especially effective against them. Fire elementals also are mindless, so they don't need to worry about that fear aura from Hydras, and they're immune to poison, so they're essentially a perfect answer. So this means that we're going to want to rush Conjuration 5, instead of going to Conjuration 3 and then proceeding on to Enchantment 4 for Flaming Arrows, and then Enchantment 5 for Horde of Skeletons. We're going to go for the full-size elementals, because that means that we'll essentially have an answer to their sacreds already. That Tribless is very expensive, so we know that Pythium most likely has reduced scales, so we can expect our research to outpace theirs by a fair bit. So if we do need to fight an early war, as long as we can get some research underway, we should be able to fight back fairly effectively. Because the Hydras themselves are very expensive, each one of those full-size Hydras costs more than a mage, which means that it's actually definitely okay to trade Fire Gems for them. And then here we have another easy expansion battle. As far as our unexpected events go, this is actually a positive event, so lucky us. This is a negative event, but none too damaging, just a bit of Dominion loss. And then here, Dysentery just increases Sloth, but that's not too big of a problem. We don't plan on recruiting anything here, so it just means a little bit less income. I'm moving scouts into Pythium's territory now, mostly just to see how large they are, and how far their dominion spreads. And then here we see another one of Pythium's expansion parties, which in spite of being quite small, had no trouble taking on that fairly difficult farm province. We'll also just be leaving this one to them. So yeah, Pythium's Bless is going to be difficult for us to take on, just because we are by default reliant on crossbows. But once we do get some research underway and we hit Conjuration 3, we'll have something that can fight them, and once we hit Conjuration 5, we'll be able to fight them very well. Marignan, if I don't need to fight Pythium, is definitely going to be my target. So Marignan is fairly weak early. Just by their nature, they are a nation that doesn't expand particularly well. They're reliant heavily on those crossbows and yeah, pretty much just crossbows and like some sort of infantry frontline to expand. And we're just better at that than Marignan is. Our crossbows deal more damage, our sacreds are tankier, so it's definitely a war that we have a massive advantage in. Marignan's early research goals are actually rather similar to ours in that they want to get fire online for some flaming crossbow action. And then after that, Marignan becomes a blood nation. They're actually quite a good blood nation because they have some national summons. And they have just ubiquitous blood access. They are able to recruit them out of every fort with a lab, so they're able to get blood hunting going quite well, which means that they can build up a blood economy, and then that's going to naturally outpace any non-blood nation. So that means that we do need to fight them early in order to take them on. And given that they're this close to the coast, while I don't know exactly where Marignan is, and while Marignan does like expanding up coastlines, given that we know that Pythium's over here, we also don't particularly expect Marignan to be all that large. So they're a small nation, they're relatively weak early. The only way that Marignan is capable of getting to a decent size early is by taking an Awake Expander, but given that they took an N9 Bless and that they have decent scales, including Magic, Order, and Growth, and Luck, I can presume that they have either an Imprisoned or Dormant God, most likely Imprisoned. So if I'm correct, that means that they're going for a greedy Scales Bless build, with an N9 Bless being primarily aimed at their Fallen Angels, which is their National Blood Summon. And because it's a greedy build, it's relatively weak early on, so even while they would become a threat later game, as long as I can fight them early, I'll definitely win. And because they're small, like I mentioned, I just have a massive advantage. So I'm basically just going to need to check with Pythium and make sure that we can remain peaceful. I'm going to continue building up castles over here I'm going to build up a castle over here so that it doesn't overlap with the resources here, just in case I do need to fight them early. I'm going to wrap up basically taking on the Indie provinces between Marignan and myself, and then continue castle production while continuing to expand up over this way. It's still the first year, and I've already got pretty much more than my fair share of provinces on the map, so my expansion is definitely decent. More importantly, though, my expansion parties are still largely healthy. While I did lose the mage over here, I still have just a lot of sacreds out, so while my expansion is on par with what you would expect of, say, like an Awake Snake build or something similar, because I took a Heavy Bless build instead and used that for my expansion, I have just a lot more units with which to fight. So my actual invasion of Marignan might not start right away. I'm definitely going to start preparing for it. However, I'm still going to go to Conjuration 5 in my research just in case I do need to fight Pythium, because I can beat Marignan with minimal research or even potentially no research at all, whereas the same is not true for those hydras that we saw. Just to comment on what's going on elsewhere in the world, we've discovered some other nations. So seeing these provinces over here, I actually assumed that Gath was somewhere in this area. Joman, I know, is over here, and his expansion over this way means that the fact that Gath got all the way over to here first means that Gath is either rather close by or Joman has somewhat poor expansion. Given that Gath is building a temple here and that Gath's temples are very expensive, we can assume that he wants to fort this province, possibly even already has a fort under construction. So far I see enemy dominion in the water, but no real actual contest there. And over here we see that TNG is already in Ulm's cap circle. So this is potentially a fight that's going to break out, since if TNG doesn't feel like ceding this province peacefully, Ulm needs to fight them for it, because naturally you can't just let an enemy keep a cap circle province. So this means that TNG is more than likely going to be occupied with dealing with Ulm for now. So that's my northern neighbor occupied, and Joman doesn't seem to be expanding very well, so I probably won't need to worry about this all too much. And that also means that I can potentially get the chance to expand up here, and possibly even grab this province, which would be great. Farms on this map are very valuable, and being able to get another farm province over here, even though it's only 2 spaces from my capital, it's still somewhat outside of the path that I've chosen to expand, so it's like Probably something that I'm going to fort and ignore and just use for income for a while I wage my war on Marignon. And that's the turn.